So the first part of this kind of series of longer videos I wanted to get into is how to kind of look at options for how you might go about finding a better way of life that involves not always being in the US, but isn't necessarily like completely cutting yourself off from the US. And for a lot of like the costs and things, I'm gonna base it on New York because that's where I'm currently living, and because it's one of the most expensive cities in the U.S., which means that things that apply here will pretty much economically at least translate to other places. In terms of a practical sense. And I think the best way to sort of start this is to realize that as a US citizen, you have access to visa-free travel to over 100 countries. And depending on the region and location, you can be there for either 90 days out of every 180 days on kind of a rolling clock, or you can be there for 180 days in a single stretch out of any given year. Basically, it works out to be the same thing. It's just whether or not you can stay continuously for 180 days or they have to split it into two sections. And so with this, it means that you don't need to go through a visa application process to begin your relocation process. It also means you don't have to commit to a single location when you're planning to relocate. You can try a place for a while, see if it suits you, and then move to another and see how that works. Now, there are some exceptions. Things like the European Union, specifically the Schengen zone, which there's like Iceland is part of Schengen, but not the EU. Switzerland is sort of in there too, right? There's a couple of places that, aren't in the EU. But broadly speaking, the EU is a single block. So you get 90 days out of every 180 days in the EU as a whole. But there's also a lot of nations that are candidate nations or near the EU that are not part of it that, you could transition between if you wanted to stay geographically in a particular region. There is also a lot of wonderful options for things like the Caribbean. And one of the benefits of not committing to a single location is that you can, say, move with weather. If you have a health condition that does not do well in the cold, but it also doesn't do well in the extreme heat, you can move between two places, 90 days in one, 90 days in another, and make sure that the seasons sync up appropriately for your health needs, right? So you could be in Mexico for your winter and then move to, say, like Norway or Denmark or Latvia for your summers. And then, those in-between times, you can kind of figure out an intermediary place. The next big thing to think about is the fact that you do not need to abandon your economic stability base, or what little stability there is, when doing this. And you do not need to be working in the place you go. And in fact, it's actually easier to do this if you think about the place you are living and the place you are working as two separate locations. Because the moment you break those two up, you open up a whole lot more options for how you go about living your life. And this is really where our type of work is a huge benefit, because we can do our work in bursts. And that leads me to the next part, which is how to set something for this up. And a big one is we are a community and we do not succeed or thrive alone. And we never have. And remembering that your community is the source of your success, and relying on that community will help you a lot. Because let's say you have a lease and it's for a 1 bedroom, or maybe you have a roommate that's in the same industry and you have a lease for a 2 bedroom apartment or a 1 bedroom with a kitchen area. You could very easily set up like the living room space as a workspace and the private bedroom as kind of a crash pad bedroom. And then instead of renting alone, split the rent 3 or 4 ways. And you might be thinking, with that, we have a 1 bedroom apartment. We now have 4 people who want to split that rent. Okay, you only have 2 people on the lease, but you can work that out. And one thing you can do with that situation is, now you've got a workspace and a private space set up. Well, you can be there 1 week out of every month, or 2 weeks out of every month, whatever works for you. But you're cutting those costs way down, right? Instead of having to have a large 2 bedroom apartment, a second workspace, whatever it is, paying for hotels, all that. And because you're not living there full time, you can set up your security there, you can take care of each other, but you're not paying multiple rents, or you're not paying a rent alone, or even a 1 bedroom apartment split between 4 people is way cheaper. If you have a 1 bedroom apartment that rents for $2,000-$3,000 a month, if you split that 3 or 4 ways, you're talking about paying now $750 to $1,000 a month, utilities included, for your home and your workspace. And then, sure, you have to pay your travel costs back and forth. That is an added expense. But when your average living costs are based on somewhere like the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Portugal, Latvia, where you're not paying for U.S. health insurance anymore. You're here 1 week. You can buy travel insurance for the U.S. and you have a residency outside the U.S., right? So for healthcare, you're paying less. For food, you're paying less than half of what it costs, even in like rural Kentucky, rural Alabama. Our food prices here are 3 to 4 times what they are overseas. And so even with paying for one share of an apartment rent that's $1,000 a month, and even paying for one share of your flights back and forth, that might be another $1,000 a month. You also rack up hella frequent flyer miles doing this, so you'll start to get free upgrades and all that. But that's $2,000 a month, which is way less than you're paying in the U.S. And when the monthly cost of living somewhere else is $800 to $1,000 a month, that's less than you might be paying just in rent in the U.S. in a lot of expensive cities. And again, you talk about Vietnam, you're talking about a cost of living of like $300 a month. So it is fiscally achievable if you work together and split your domestic U.S. costs with other people. And another huge component of that is that your domestic, if you're working and doing all your work in the U.S. where you have a passport, you don't need to worry about work requirements, or, no one cares about what job you're doing when you're not in their country. The U.S. is pretty much the only country that does care about all that. And with banking services like Revolut, where you can open an account with them, put money in the U.S., exchange it for euros, that can help a lot, or exchange it for a lot of other currencies. That can help a lot because you might not have, a bank account in the place you're going to be, but you can have a bank account that at least lets you, exchange into the currencies where you're going to be. And again, this is obviously distinct from like being a digital nomad, right? I'm talking about people who do various forms of in-person work here. And I'm talking about people who are, on the more normal side of things, who are not, ultra successful, ultra well known, online. This is a real practical solution for a lot of people. And again, when you think about if you compact most of your bookings into 1 week, that you would have in a month, it can be a lot more practical, right? And you can also build up excitement that way, right? There's a marketing opportunity there. And you also have the opportunity to travel with other people and split costs of your overseas living with these other people as well, right? You can do a short-term rental. If you get a 3-month short-term rental and, it's a 2-bedroom and you're renting it for €1,200 a month, which is totally reasonable, by the way. Like, that's the cost difference. Now you're talking about your domestic is $700 a month, which is about €600. Now your cost of living, in Europe, if you're splitting that between 2 people, 3-month rental, €1,200, €1,300 a month. Now your total cost of living is €1,200 a month. And, flights back and forth again, make it €2,200 a month. That's still less than you were paying in rent in the US, let alone our health insurance bill, let alone all of those things that you don't have in the US. And then the other benefit is, other than doing marketing, when you're outside the US, you're basically on vacation. That is all mental health recovery time now, right? Having that US passport and being able to come here just for like 1 week a month or 2 weeks out of every 6 weeks or whatever works for you, that really extends things. And if you do it, say, 2 weeks out of every 6 weeks, well, 90 days is, 3 months. It's about 6 weeks. So if you do 2 weeks out of every 6 weeks, then you are actually, 2 weeks out of every 6 weeks means, you're splitting things between 3 people. But now you're also extending that 90-day visa period, because every 14 days you're not within the country you're living in, you're adding a month to that. So now you're at 4 months per stint. Right, and that's per that block. So then, let's say you have 4 months in that stint. So now you have 4 months is a third of a year. So now you only need 3 different locations. You need kind of a fall, winter, a spring, summer, and then some in between location. And that is doable, right? This is a very doable plan. And then once you're doing that, if you're still doing your work, if you're still building up, once you have that breathing room, once you're not experiencing having to pay for a car, once you're not having to pay absurd food prices, once you, all those noises are just the lovely little kitties being lovely little kitties, by the way. Once you're doing all of those things, then it becomes incredibly practical to really start saving money and building up a savings. And once you do that, once you're, getting more accustomed to a couple of cultures, you could apply for a student visa there for a language intensive program, like a 1-year language intensive. And that would come with a visa where now you can stay there, as many days in that year as you like. And you can still fly back to the US to work during your academic breaks, during your vacation times, right? So you can still afford it, but now you're talking about, now you have a national ID, now you can get regular rent, right? You can use that rotating living platform to build up stability that you cannot achieve while trying to primarily live in the US, right? It is not possible to achieve that stability in the US anymore. But by splitting your time between places, you can achieve that stability. And then you can use that to make a move into an education visa. You get the education visa, you do the language intensive. Now you speak the language there. You're still saving up money because, education programs outside the US, you can get, freshman year all the way through a PhD, an 8-year program is like €1,000 a year. Books, all your materials included. Everything. You could wind up with a PhD for $8,000 euro, about 10 grand. So talking about going to a 1-year language intensive or a 3-year bachelor's program, that's doable. That's very doable. And that gets you a student visa. And if you spend 5 years in a lot of countries, in any EU country, you get a permanent residence permit if you are college educated, if you are highly skilled, which you would be if you did that education visa. But you need the stability first. And so that's really where all this comes together, right? Is step one, find a small community of people that you can get together and figure out a way to divide your living costs in the US. And time cycle it so that instead of needing one apartment each or, live with 2 or 3 people, you can get a very small apartment and divide those costs between all of you. And again, like if you're okay sharing a bedroom with someone, once, 1 week out of every month, you could put a bunk bed in there and split a 1-bedroom apartment 8 ways, right? 2 people officially on the lease, and then, you have friends over the whole time. And, now you're talking about $400. And when you're there, because there's 2 people there, you have someone kind of for security there the whole time, right? So that's a very viable option. And so doing that, having that kind of a situation, it opens the door to building that stability. And that's the key. That's the thing that I think a lot of people fear not having. But the reality is that stability is available. As long as you think a little bit outside the box and you're not thinking about visa programs at the beginning. If you start thinking about, okay, I have this gateway to get to a whole lot of places, how can I leverage that to reduce my living costs, get access to the healthcare that I need at an affordable price, and then move forward with my life? And that does exist for pretty much all of us.